Welcome to the second part of my exploration into eGPU with the 2013 Mac Pro and my 13-inch MacBook Pro. And in the first part we got the eGPU connected via Thunderbolt 2 to the Mac Pro, and we ran some benchmarks in Unigine Valley. The results showed that eGPUs can make a big difference, and that the trade-off from Thunderbolt 3 to Thunderbolt 2 is not as much as you might think. But Unigine Valley is really a gaming benchmark. And what I'd like to know is how effective the eGPU is for pro apps. So in this episode, we'll be taking a look at video editing with Final Cut Pro. And I've got some interesting results to share with you. So I've shot some sample video footage using both my Panasonic G9 and my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. I went out into the garden and I shot 4 15-second clips with each camera. And I've tried to keep the footage as similar as possible so that we get a fair test. I'm shooting in 4K resolution at 25 frames per second because that's what I normally do. We'll create a Final Cut project for each of the cameras with the timeline set to output 1080p at 25 frames per second. This is exactly how I shoot for YouTube. Because shooting at 4K and outputting 1080p gives me plenty of scope for cropping and zooming in on things in the edit. Plus, what I've found is that you get a better quality 1080p image if you're down-resing from 4K. The footage from the G9 is at 150 megabits per second and uses the H.264 codec, as far as I'm aware. But the Blackmagic footage is closer to 600 megabits per second and will use ProRes 422. My expectation is that the ProRes footage will be quicker to work with and quicker to render, despite being a much larger file. 4 times the size, in fact. But of course, ProRes is Apple's codec, and Final Cut Pro does work very well with it. There are 3 areas where we might expect the eGPU to boost performance. Firstly, editing response. So we'd expect the eGPU to improve timeline scrubbing in Final Cut Pro and the playback of video. And we'll test this before we do any background rendering to make sure that we're not using a background render or any proxy media. And the second area is background rendering. You see, Final Cut Pro allows you to specify the eGPU for background renders. Although in my experience that doesn't actually mean that Final Cut will use the eGPU, but we'll see what happens in our test. And the third area is the final rendering, your final output file. And again, in my experience, whether or not the eGPU gets used, it seems to depend on the codec of the footage. Now just bear in mind that the background render format is ProRes 422. What we'll do is time the background renders and the final render so that we get some points of comparison. But along the way we'll also monitor CPU usage and both internal and external GPU usage to see where the work is actually being done. So I'll run the set of tests 4 times, twice on the Mac Pro with and without the eGPU, and twice on the MacBook Pro. Again, with and without the eGPU. So first of all, if you're not familiar with my kit, I better tell you what I've got. I'm running a 2013 Mac Pro, which has dual D300 GPUs. We've got the E5-2697 version 2 CPU, that's the 12 core, and there's 64 gigabytes of ECC RAM. My 13-inch MacBook Pro is the 2018 model. It's got the top Core i7-8559U quad-core CPU, and that's got Iris Pro 955 graphics. It's equipped with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And I'm going to set up the Final Cut Pro libraries on the internal SSDs of each machine to avoid any potential bottlenecking from the storage. Obviously the MacBook Pro has a much faster internal SSD, but my Mac Pro has been upgraded. It has a Generation 3 Apple SSD, which is almost twice as fast as the Generation 2 SSD that came as standard. But just remember that both SSDs are capable of speeds far in excess of the bitrate of the footage we're capturing. So neither machine should be bottlenecked by the storage. This test should be purely down to CPU and GPU. And finally, of course, the eGPU that we're using, that's a Razer Core X Chroma. You might be able to just see it behind me there. And inside is a Sapphire Radeon RX 5700 XT Nitro Plus Special Edition. Bit of a mouthful. It's a slightly overclocked 5700 XT. Both computers are running the same version of macOS Catalina, and therefore they have the right drivers for this GPU. Of course, the MacBook Pro has an advantage because it connects via Thunderbolt 3, and that's a configuration that's fully supported by Apple. But the Mac Pro, on the other hand, is connecting via Thunderbolt 2, using Apple's Thunderbolt 3 to 2 adapter, and this is not a configuration that Apple officially supports. I've used a third-party script called Purge Wrangler to enable support for eGPU. You need to watch part 1 of this series if you want to see how to do that. Both computers are going to connect to the 4K monitor behind me that's running in a scaled resolution, and I'll be using QuickTime as a screen recorder in each case. Now just remember, this isn't a competition between the Mac Pro and the MacBook Pro. The focus of this video is about whether or not internal GPU is better than external GPU or vice versa, specifically to Final Cut Pro on these two different computers. And I should just say that my tests are representative of my workflow, but they won't necessarily match yours. And as you'll see, results will vary depending on the codecs being used, the CPU you have, the amount of RAM, and the GPU architecture. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get started with the tests. And we'll begin with the 2013 Mac Pro without the eGPU connected. Let's load up the Blackmagic ProRes footage. Now the screen recording doesn't properly capture the playback and scrubbing experience, but I can assure you that playback is very smooth and scrubbing through the timeline is likewise fast and it's smooth. I've put the 4 15-second clips that I captured into a timeline. I've added a fade in at the start and a fade out at the end. You'll also notice that I've got this adjustment layer above the clips. I'm using this just to apply a simple luma grade. So what we're talking about there is just adjusting the contrast to maximize the dynamic range of the footage. On the Blackmagic footage, I've also added some saturation because the original clips are recorded with a very flat color profile, but I haven't done any color grading. The Panasonic footage gets the same treatment, except that I've desaturated that footage as it comes off the camera very vibrant. And I wanted to make the tests as fair as possible, so a luma grade and a bit of saturation adjustment in each case. Now let's start the background render. As you can see, it's going to use the internal dual D300 GPUs on the Mac Pro. And the result is that it renders in 18 seconds. To accomplish that, it appears that all the CPU cores are getting involved and are roughly 50% utilized. The display GPU is maxed out and the compute GPU is running at roughly 50 to 60%. We'll compare all of the render times at the end, but it's not surprising that this footage doesn't take very long to render because it's already in that render codec of ProRes 422. But let's now do a final render. And for this, I'm just going to do a simple share for Apple devices, outputting at 1080p. I've got this set to use the H.264 codec on the faster encode setting. So we're essentially converting from ProRes into H.264 in this case. Now we can see that the CPU cores are working very hard. The display GPU is 70 to 80% utilized, but the compute GPU isn't used at all. And the render completes in 58 seconds. Actually, these final renders will provide a useful comparison of the performance between this older Mac Pro and a newer MacBook Pro. And we'd expect all of the times to be fairly similar because once that background render is done into the ProRes 422 format, the final render is essentially just that same task of converting that background rendered file into our final H.264 format. Let's try the footage from the Panasonic G9. Again, we haven't got the eGPU connected yet. And it does seem that the Mac Pro is less happy with this H.264 4K footage. Even though the bitrate and the file size is 4 times smaller than the Blackmagic footage, you can see that the computer is struggling a little with the playback. It's a little bit slow on scrubbing and the playback is definitely dropping frames. But let's see how the background render goes. Now the computer is obviously working harder to convert this footage because all the CPU cores are now fully utilized, as is the display GPU, and the compute GPU is chipping in at around 20% too. And all of this effort finishes the background render in 57 seconds. So it takes 3 times as long to convert video footage that is a quarter of the size. Note also that it used less GPU but more CPU in order to achieve this. After we've done the background render, the timeline performance is now great. We're not dropping frames anymore. I think this really goes to show that performance, when it comes to video editing, will depend largely on the codecs that you're editing and rendering. Speaking of rendering, let's do the final render in the same way as we did previously. And we can see that the CPU and GPU usage is the same as the previous render. And that's what we expect to see because it's basically doing the same job. The completion time is 55 seconds, which again is pretty much the same, allowing for a small amount of variance because, of course, the footage from the two cameras isn't precisely identical. So from this, we can see that my 2013 Mac Pro is perfectly usable for editing 4K content at high bit rates, providing it uses the ProRes 422 codec. And this was a big motivating factor for me in choosing the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. But you don't need to go and drop a load of money on a new camera. You could simply transcode your footage that you're shooting before you import it to Final Cut Pro. And then you'll get that better editing and rendering experience. That said, I can't deny that it is really convenient to just grab the SSD off the Blackmagic, plug it into the computer, import the footage in without needing to do anything to it. It's massively sped up my workflow. Could we speed things up even more on this Mac Pro by bringing the eGPU into the equation? Let's plug it in and do the same tests again, starting with the Blackmagic footage. Again, timeline scrubbing and playback in the timeline is completely flawless, though it may not look like it on the screen recording. If we do the background render, you'll see that we've got the RX 5700 XT selected. And we can see that the CPU cores, whilst we're doing the render, are more utilized than when we didn't have the eGPU plugged in. The eGPU itself is running at about 50 to 60%, and we notice also that that Compute D300 GPU is chipping in. That's interesting. And all of this gives us a fast background render of just 15 seconds. Now let's try the final render. What we see is less CPU action this time. And again, the eGPU is running at around 60%, this time with no help from the D300s. The final render is completed in 40 seconds. So for this footage, the eGPU reduced the background render by 3 seconds, which is about a 17% improvement. And on the final render, we saved 18 seconds, and that's about 31% better. Will we see the same improvements, though, with the G9 footage? Let's have a look. So with the eGPU plugged in, we can see that timeline scrubbing for this footage is much improved and playback isn't dropping frames now. So the eGPU has helped out in that area. But let's start the background render. We can see this time there's less CPU usage. The eGPU is sitting at around 50% and the Compute D300 GPU is at maybe 10 to 20%. So a completely different distribution to the background render on the Blackmagic footage. And the final render time ends up being 1 minute and 24 seconds. So for this H.264 footage, the background render actually takes about 50% longer if you have the eGPU plugged in. But what about the final render? The distribution here of CPU and GPU usage is about the same as the previous render. And again, the eGPU beats the onboard GPUs, finishing in 44 seconds, so roughly a 20% improvement. So it's a bit of a mixed bag of results. Can we draw any conclusions at this point? Remember, we're looking at 3 areas that the eGPU could help. Firstly, timeline performance. Regardless of the codec we're using, the 5700 XT GPU has got more than enough power to ensure a smooth editing experience, even when you factor in that Thunderbolt 2 bottleneck. So I think we can call this a win. Secondly was background renders. And here it seems to completely depend on the codec. We got improved render times with the ProRes 422 footage, but the system was really dragged down when we used the H.264 footage off of the Panasonic. This has been my experience before I bought the Blackmagic camera. Render times just seemed slower with the eGPU when I was working with the footage off of my Panasonic G9. So the codec is important, but even with the ProRes 422 footage, the eGPU didn't massively improve performance. I don't think there's enough benefit here to call it a win on this point. Thirdly, of course, we were hoping for improved final render times. And with our H.264 output file, the eGPU improved those render times by around 20 to 30%. I mean, it wasn't a massive margin in the amount of time saved, but of course our project is only a minute long. On a much larger timeline, the gains could be huge. That said, we only tested one output render codec, and I expect gains will again be codec dependent. For my workflow, I render for YouTube using H.264, or I'm creating master files in ProRes 422. And the eGPU does improve both of these, so I'm going to say it's a win here, at least for me anyway. Before we draw final conclusions though, let's look at the same tests on the MacBook Pro. And we'll start again with the Blackmagic footage, without the eGPU connected. So we're just going to be relying only on that onboard Iris 955 GPU. And that is by no means a powerful GPU. But the MacBook Pro does have an ace up its sleeve in Apple's T2 chip, which can be used to hardware accelerate H.264 and H.265 video encoding and decoding. So it'd be interesting to see if that makes a difference. So let's load up the Blackmagic footage. And when it comes to the timeline performance here, it's slow and we're dropping frames, which is probably to be expected, but let's start the background render. Now oddly, the MacBook needed 2 passes at this render. It actually rendered the second quarter of the timeline and then it did a second pass where it did the other 3 quarters. I forgot to put up the GPU monitor window, but I guess we can assume that it was working hard because CPU usage was only at 30 to 40%. And the final render time ended up being 6 minutes and 34 seconds. If you'll recall, the Mac Pro took just 18 seconds. That's a big difference, but I suspect the result is a little misleading because it was probably a bottleneck due to those huge files and the MacBook Pro having a lack of video RAM for the onboard GPU. Certainly it wouldn't be much fun working with this footage on this laptop. But what we find even after the background render, the timeline scrubbing is still a little slow. The final render though should be better. Let's set it going. Now we can see that the CPU cores are running around 40 to 50%, and we end up finishing in 52 seconds, which is actually a little quicker than the Mac Pro, and achieved with apparently much less effort. So I'm going to say that's down to the T2 chip. Let's try the Panasonic footage. The timeline performance here is just awful. It's really jerky when you're scrubbing, and playback is clearly dropping lots of frames. I have to say I was expecting better with that T2 chip on board, but it's obviously not working for this particular case. Let's see what happens though when we do the background render. Again, we're seeing similar CPU usage and it takes a long time, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Faster than the Blackmagic footage in this case, but again, even when this is done, timeline scrubbing is still not perfect with the rendered footage. Let's do the final render now. CPU usage is the same as before and the end result is 48 seconds. So the MacBook Pro again outperforms the Mac Pro for the final render. Surely the external GPU will improve this experience, particularly when you consider the MacBook Pro is connecting via Thunderbolt 3 and it will therefore be able to use more of the eGPU's potential. So we start again with the Blackmagic footage. There are no issues with the timeline performance now, it's really fast and responsive. Let's try the background render. We can see that the CPU cores are working hard. They're now at roughly 70 to 80% utilization, and the eGPU is looking at around 90 to 100%. So perhaps it's no surprise then that the render finishes in 47 seconds. So that's almost 8.5 times faster than the time we got without the eGPU connected. Although remember that this same task on the Mac Pro with the eGPU only took 15 seconds. Despite the Mac Pro being able to use less of the eGPU's potential because of that Thunderbolt 2 connection. So why is there such a big difference between the two? Well, if you recall, one of the D300s was also working when we did the background render, but the main reason is simply processor cores. The Mac Pro is significantly faster for multi-threaded applications with its 12-core Xeon CPU. And it could be that the RAM is also helping. The Mac Pro has a lot more of it, although it is running at a slower speed than the RAM in the MacBook Pro. Let's try the final render. Here we can see the CPU cores are now running at about 30 to 40%, and the eGPU is likewise at about 40%. And that final time then of 39 seconds is pretty much identical to the Mac Pro, and about 25% faster than when we ran the test without the eGPU. So finally, let's try the Panasonic footage with the eGPU on the MacBook Pro. Again, timeline performance is perfect, no issues here at all, so let's go on to the background render. And incredibly, it finishes in just 20 seconds, so that's almost 14 times faster than without the eGPU. And it's also much quicker than the Mac Pro. So this has to be partly due, at least, to the MacBook being able to access more of the eGPU's performance, and I'm pretty sure that T2 chip is helping out too. Let's try the final render. Again, CPU utilization at 30 to 40% and eGPU at about 40%. And our final render time is 41 seconds. So very similar to the Mac Pro with the eGPU, and a small improvement on the 48 seconds that this MacBook scored when we didn't have the eGPU connected. So let's review the MacBook's performance against our three measurements. And first is timeline performance. Well, it's clear that the eGPU massively improves timeline performance. If you've got one of these MacBook Pros, the 13-inch model without a discrete graphics card, or indeed a newer Mac Mini, then an eGPU is going to make a big difference for you with video editing. Secondly, when it comes to background renders, the eGPU again makes a dramatic difference. The render times were orders of magnitude better than the onboard Iris graphics could manage on their own. And third, on our final render times, like with the Mac Pro, the gains are not as huge, but renders are definitely quicker, and these time savings would add up on larger projects. So we need to draw some conclusions and answer some questions. Should you invest in eGPU for video editing on the 2013 Mac Pro? I don't think we can give a clear-cut answer to that. It does provide an improvement for my workflow, but the gains are probably not sufficient to justify the investment. After all, the 5700 XT and the Razer enclosure is not a particularly cheap combination. Of course, you're losing a bunch of performance due to the Thunderbolt 2 bottleneck, so it could be the case that you could use an eGPU with a less powerful graphics card in it and you would still get similar performance figures. Ultimately, you need to look at your workflow to decide what gains you might be able to achieve. In my case, I can use the eGPU with both of my computers, so that makes the investment a little easier to justify. Is it worth buying an eGPU to pair with a MacBook Pro 13-inch for video editing? Absolutely. I love having the portability of the smaller form factor of this notebook, but then having the ability to turbo boost that performance when I'm back at my desk. That's fantastic. eGPUs do improve video editing performance in Final Cut Pro. However, it's also true that they don't improve performance as much as they used to. In Final Cut Pro version 10.4.7, Apple introduced new code for the 2019 Mac Pro, and in doing so they seem to have hurt performance for other computers. You might have noticed that my Mac Pro didn't fully utilize its second GPU, and I'm pretty sure it used to. You also need to know that the drivers for the latest AMD GPUs, like the 5700 XT, are only available in Catalina, and the 2013 Mac Pro doesn't always play nice with Catalina, particularly if you've added an eGPU. My system doesn't like waking up from sleep. It seems to kernel panic and then crash. So obviously I've just disabled that in the system preferences, so it's not a great big deal, but it's just something to be aware of. I'm also aware of reports that 2018 Mac Minis that are using eGPUs with AMD ProRes GPUs, things like the RX 580, are also experiencing issues in Catalina. It's probably no coincidence that Apple has actually stopped selling eGPUs at the moment. So before you go and spend your money, make sure you do your research. So let's pop that comparison card back up on the screen for a few seconds so that you can pause it if you want to look at those results in any detail. Now, in our first episode we looked at gaming performance. Now we've looked at video editing performance, and I think next I'd like to see whether or not photo editing can be improved with an eGPU. So if you'd like to see that, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be notified when I release that episode. And that's it for now. Hopefully my hard work has been enough to earn a thumbs up, but in any case, I'll see you next time for some more geekery.